Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory and welcome to this next video from the series called Modern Identity powered by Azure. In this video, I would like to talk about single tenant and multi-tenant applications in Microsoft Entra ID, so previously Azure Active Directory. When it comes to single tenant applications, some concepts can be simple. But when it comes to building multi-tenant applications, there can be some confusion around how to properly register and configure those applications in Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So that's why I decided to create this video to clarify some concepts. So let's start. This is quite a huge topic, so before we will start with some practice, as always, it's good to talk about some theory. So let's start with the tenant concept, so Microsoft Entra ID tenant concept. So what is tenant? Microsoft Entra ID organizes objects like users and applications into groups called tenants. Tenants allow an administrator to set policies on the users within the organization and the applications that the organization owns to meet their security and operational policies. So every organization that is using Azure AD can register applications, can manage users within this tenant, can configure conditional access policies. So basically the tenant is this place where we can manage objects like users, like applications, and basically we can apply different kinds of policies and configurations. Now, when it comes to applications, there is a question: who can sign in? So when we talk about applications and who can sign in, there is this concept of single tenant and multi-tenant application. When we register application in Microsoft Entra ID, we can decide who can sign in. So basically, application can be registered as single tenant or multi-tenant application. So let's start with single tenant application. Single tenant applications are only available in the tenant they were registered in and also known as their home tenant. So basically, in this specific scenario, we have Microsoft Entra ID tenant, we can register application there, and users from this home tenant will be able to successfully authenticate and access this application. So as I mentioned, it means that only users from the home tenant will be able to sign in to such application. So it's quite simple. Single tenant application, users can access this application, can authenticate, but only users from this specific tenant where application was registered. Now, moving forward, when it comes to single tenant app registration, all user and guest accounts in Microsoft Entra ID Directory can use login to application and access APIs, if registered, obviously. So when we are registering application, we can see some tab, as we can see above on the slide, like register an application, and below we have supported account types. So this option is recommended if your target audience is internal to your organization. So under supported account types, where we have this question, who can use this application or access this API, we should select accounts in this organizational directory only. So as you can see, only users from this Microsoft Entra tenant will be able to successfully access this specific application and authenticate, obviously, with the account registered in the Microsoft Entra ID. Okay. So now I would like to go through the app registration process and show you a single tenant application demo. So let's see it in action. Here is Microsoft Entra Admin Center, and under app registrations, here under this tab, we can register new application in our Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So if I click new registration, we can see that I can provide the application name, but the most important thing here in this specific context is supported account types section. So who can use this application or access this API? We can see that here we have few options. We will talk about all of them in this video. But for now, the most important for us is accounts in this organizational directory only. So single tenant. It means that only users from this Microsoft Entra ID tenant will be able to successfully authenticate and use this application. So here I have already created and registered single tenant application. You can see it has its own unique application client ID, but also, as you can see, under supported account types, there is information my organization only. It means that this is single tenant application and users only from this Entra ID tenant will be able to successfully authenticate and use this application. So now if we switch to the source code, to the Blazor WebAssembly application, I want to show you the sign-in experience. So let's do it now. Here is my web application and I will click Login button. And right now I'm redirected to the Microsoft Entra ID authorization endpoint. And here I have to provide the username. So I will use the user account that is registered in this home Entra ID tenant. So here I'm providing the username, I'm providing the password, and as you can see, there is this information, this permissions request. So basically it's about consents, and before user can access this application, user has to consent. So has to grant permissions. So this application would like to view your basic profile and basically maintain access to data you have given it access to. So basically it's about the basic profile. So it's asking you whether you are granting your permission for this application to access your basic profile. So obviously if you click cancel, you will be redirected back to the application. You will be not authenticated successfully. But if you will click accept, then the permission or permissions will be granted. Important information here, you can see this information, this application is not published by Microsoft. So this is very important information, yeah, like it's displayed that this is not Microsoft application, it's for the security purpose. And we will talk more about this consent screen in our video later. So I will click accept button. And after successful authentication, I should be redirected back to my Blazor application. So as we can see below, there are ID token claims. There is also this greeting, hello Adele. And if I scroll down, you can see that those are the claims from the ID token that was returned by Microsoft Entra ID tenant after successful authentication by this user. Perfect. So right now, I can start using this application. Obviously, this application can call Web API or Web APIs, and we will talk about those scenarios too. But for now, it's purely about the single tenant application and user authentication. Okay, perfect. So now I will log out from this application. So here I will select Adele account to sign out. And what we will see here right now, I will try to use user account from another Entra ID tenant. So we will see what will happen if I will try to use another user account from another tenant to sign in to this specific application. In this case, I have to click login button again. I'm redirected to the authorization endpoint of Entra ID tenant. And I will click use another account here. And here I will provide user account from another tenant, as you can see. So this is not my home tenant. This is user from another Entra ID tenant. I will click next. Obviously, I will have to provide the password in this case. And as you can see, there is this information display. The user account from identity provider does not exist in the tenant and cannot access the application. And obviously those are the details. But the case is that with this account from another Entra ID, we cannot access this specific application. And this is I would say, the most important part here to remember. Like if we have single tenant application, only users from this home tenant Entra ID will be able to authenticate and access this application. If we try to use any external account to access this specific application, then we will see this error here. So that's why it's very important to think before we will implement and secure our application, whether this application should be single tenant or maybe multi-tenant application. Okay, great. So now it's time to get back to our presentation. So let's talk about multi-tenant application. Multi-tenant applications are available to users in both their home Entra ID tenant and other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. This is very important. Yeah. So in a single tenant application, we saw that when I used the account from another Entra ID tenant, I could not authenticate and access application. But here we talk about multi-tenant application. So I can use a user account from another Entra ID directory to sign in and access application. So in this specific scenario, it means that users from external organizations that use Microsoft Entra ID will be able to log in and access the application. That's the difference between single tenant application and multi-tenant application. Now, let's talk about the audience type for multi-tenant applications. When we configure multi-tenant application, we can basically decide what will be the audience of such application. So let's dive into this topic basically. So we can target user accounts in any Microsoft Entra ID directory or accounts in any Microsoft Entra ID directory and personal Microsoft accounts such as Outlook.com. So now when we register such application, again in the Entra Admin Center, we select the second option. So accounts in any organizational directory, any Microsoft Entra ID tenant, so multi-tenant. All users and guests with work or school account from Microsoft can use our application or API. This includes schools and businesses that use Microsoft 365. This option is recommended if our target audience is business or educational customers, so external users in general. So there is also this third option, any accounts in organizational directory, so any Microsoft Entra ID tenant, multi-tenant, and personal Microsoft accounts like Skype, Xbox, and so on. Yeah. So this is third option. So personal accounts can be also used to authenticate and access such application. So accounts in any organizational directory and personal Microsoft accounts. All users with a work or school or personal Microsoft account can use application or API. It includes schools and businesses that use Microsoft 365, as well as personal accounts that are used to sign in to services like Outlook. This option is recommended if we target the, I would say, widest set of Microsoft accounts and plan to make application available for external users. So not only the corporate entities in this specific scenario. It's also very important to mention, let me get back here, that we can also target personal Microsoft accounts only, but this is a very rare scenario here. So this is this fourth option at the screenshot above on this slide. Okay, perfect. So now let's talk about login URLs. It's very important also because it's about the configuration for our application. So it's about the endpoint where our users will be redirected to successfully authenticate. So for single tenant application, it's simple. There is login.microsoftonline.com/tenant ID. So user will be redirected to the authorization endpoint of home tenant to successfully authenticate. But when we talk about multi-tenant login, only corporate accounts. Let's focus only on the corporate accounts. So this second option. So multi-tenant app where users from each Entra ID tenant can sign in. So here we use login.microsoftonline.com/organizations. So this endpoint is used, and in this specific scenario, users are redirected to this specific endpoint. And also, When it comes to multi-tenant login, all accounts, I mean corporate accounts and personal accounts like Microsoft accounts, there is this third URL called loginmicrosoftonline.com/common. And important information, the last one can be used for corporate only accounts too. So we can use the common endpoint also for the multi-tenant apps, which can be used only by the corporate accounts registered in Microsoft Entra ID tenant. One more, only Microsoft accounts login. So login.microsoftonline.com/consumers. As I mentioned, this one is not used very often. When it comes to multi-tenant applications in Entra ID, it's more about the corporate accounts and logins. Okay, perfect. So now let's talk a little bit more about the process for multi-tenant application, the process of authentication and granting permissions. So what's happening here? So as we can see on the left side, we have user, there is application, multi-tenant application registered in the Entra ID tenant. And on the right side, we have home tenant, I call it developers tenant, or it's called developers tenant, and also the user, so customers tenant. And here at the top, we have application in the developers tenant, and in the customers tenant, we have service principal. We will talk about it in a minute. So what will happen here, user will use the common endpoint to sign in. And basically, user has to consent to application. So user will authenticate and then will be asked to grant application-specific permissions. We saw it also during the demo for single tenant application. So user is authenticated, there is a consent screen displayed like, hey, this application would like to access your basic profile, let's say, and so on. So user has to grant consent, so has to grant those permissions to the application, so application can act on behalf of authenticated user. So what will happen here, when user consented successfully, there will be created something what is called service principal, and this is really important here. So let's talk about it in a minute. So the case is that the application, and it can be confusing, so let me clarify this here. And probably if you are also the programmer, coder, you will be familiar with this concept. But application is just the template. So we register application within Microsoft Entra ID tenant, and we specify who can sign in and use this application, obviously, what will be the redirect URI, what will be the permissions granted, so whether this application will use Microsoft Graph API, we'll call it, or maybe this application will call some third-party web API and so on. So application is just the template within Entra ID tenant. So if you are familiar with, for instance, objective programming, you will know that application is just a class. So basically, you can think about the application as a class in, let's say, C# language. So .NET C# is a good example here. You can create the class, and this class can have different properties, methods, basically, and this class is used to create instances. So to be more specific, we can create instance of this specific class. So in this specific context here in Microsoft Entra ID, we can register specific instance of the application, which is called service principal. It's also called app provisioning. So basically, when user consented successfully, Microsoft Entra ID will register something what is called service principal, so application will be provisioned basically in the customer's tenant. So from now, basically, this application, this service principal is created in the customer's tenant, and Entra ID administrator can access it, can limit some permissions, can check, like who can access this application with this customer's tenant and so on. So next time when this user will try to authenticate, this user will use this service principal for authentication. So it's very important to remember about it. Like, application is just the template. The service principal is the instance of the application within specific Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So, as I mentioned, to simplify that, when user will try to authenticate again, the service principal will be used. So Entra ID will check whether there is a service principal that was provisioned, and then user will be able to successfully authenticate. And we will also talk about app provisioning, so creating service principals, because there are basically two methods. Service principal can be created either once user from specific tenant consented to the application, if obviously user is allowed to do it, because administrators can block consents for users. And once user consented from specific tenant, then service principal will be created. But also administrators of Entra ID tenant can provision those applications, can register service principals within their tenants. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about user consent. When user first time accesses the application, user must consent, grant permissions. So this is what we saw when we were authenticating within the single tenant application. Before we could use the application, the consent screen is displayed. And this is what we can see on the left side of this slide. If this is the first time any user from this specific Entra ID tenant accessing multi-tenant application, service principal is created in the user's tenant. Obviously, under condition that users can consent to applications within the tenant, because there is the configuration in the Entra ID which can limit who can consent basically. So we can say only administrators can consent to multi-tenant applications. But in a typical scenario, if consents are enabled to users, then once any user consented from this specific tenant, then automatically service principal will be created. So it's called app provisioning again, yeah, or service principal provisioning. Not all permissions can be consented by the user. That's very important, yeah, like user.read, write, .all. So there is a specific set of permissions which require admin consent. So it means that even if user will try to authenticate, then user will see this screen on the left side of the slide, need admin approval. So in this specific scenario, user will not be able to consent. Administrator of the tenant has to sign in, authenticate, and grant those permissions. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there are settings for user consent. So in Microsoft Entra ID, we can control when end users or group owners are allowed to grant consents to applications and when they will be required to request administrator review and approval. So as you can see here, there is like a fragment of user consent settings, and you can see that we can decide whether all users can consent to applications, basically, or all users can consent to applications from verified publishers. We will talk about it in a minute. For selected permissions, obviously, or do not allow user consent. So only administrator can consent to applications. So this is basically recommended nowadays. So to use this option, do not allow user to consent. So if there are some special permissions, so administrator will have to grant consents. It's for the security purpose. So if we said do not allow user consent, then only administrators will be able to consent. Microsoft recommends disabling future user consent operations to reduce the risk of exposing corporate data. So that's what I mentioned before. It's recommended to disable user consent operations. I also said about the verified publishers, and I want to really quickly touch on this topic here because it's connected with multi-tenant applications. So starting November 9th, 2020, end users will no longer be able to grant consent to newly registered multi-tenant applications without verified publishers. So in this specific scenario, it means that only global administrators will have this possibility. So if there will be, like any permissions that will be required from the user before accessing the multi-tenant application, only tenant administrator will be able to grant those permissions. And this is very important, and this is really important information, because as you can see, under permissions requested, we have this information in this specific scenario, Contoso organizer. We can see that, okay, this is verified publisher, so then users will be able to consent. Yes, but basically starting from November 9th, 2020, users will not be able to grant consent to newly registered multi-tenant applications. So only global administrators will have such power. And from the security point of view, I would say it's good, because you don't want to expose your organizational data outside. So it's good to centrally manage that, to make sure that some user will not accidentally grant some permissions to the application, and then this application can access some specific data from our organization. So it's better to centrally control that by, let's say, global administrators in Microsoft Entra ID, to make sure that those consents are carefully reviewed before granting any permission to multi-tenant application. Okay, admin consent. Recommended approaches. So I mentioned that basically because of the fact that Microsoft recommends disabling consenting by users, then global administrator will have to consent. And you will find many different approaches over the internet. This can be really confusing. So I decided to present two of them, because those two are I would say the most recommended, and I would say they generate less problems, including some different changes in your application's source code and so on. So let me present those two methods. So first one is admin consent endpoint, which we'll discuss in a minute, and the second one is PowerShell script. This one has one big benefit we will talk about later. But basically, when you think about admin consent for multi-tenant applications, there are two recommended approaches: admin consent endpoint and PowerShell script, or PowerShell script basically. So let's start with admin consent endpoint. So this admin consent endpoint obviously requires Microsoft Entra ID tenant administrator to use it. And basically, administrator will have to consent when accessing multi-tenant application. So on the left side, we can see again permissions requested, so consent screen. There is also information that this application, this multi-tenant app, is not verified, as you can see. So this is about the verified publishers. So here the TMF multi-tenant app is unverified, basically. So the standard user will not be able to consent. Admin consent is required here. And as you can see, there is this information that this application would like to sign in and read user profile. This is a permission requested to access your data in Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. So this screen will be obviously displayed, and global administrator can accept or decline. It provides easy to use experience, because we can use it in the web browser, and the consent screen is displayed, and we can read those consents, we can accept them. This can be used for multi-tenant applications and web APIs provisioning, so service principal creation. That's what I mentioned before. So once global administrator will consent, will click accept button, then the application or web API is provisioned. So service principal will be created. And below we can see this admin consent endpoint. So it's login.microsoftonline.com/organization. So here we have to provide the tenant ID, the target tenant ID, where the service principal will be provisioned, /admin consent, client ID equals, and the client ID of the multi-tenant application for which we want to provision service principal in our Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Okay, So, moving forward, admin consent endpoint. We can provide a button for the administrators to easily provision service principals in their home tenants. This button can be, for instance, displayed on the, on some custom page within our application. Click here to admin consent TMF multi-tenant app. So it's the name of my multi-tenant application in your MS Entra ID tenant. Once the button is clicked, then basically we can grant consents as admin, and service principal will be provisioned. Okay, another recommended approach is the PowerShell script. This one requires Microsoft Entra ID tenant administrator to use it again. So global administrator is used here. Can be used to provision service principals for applications, web APIs, and daemon service applications. Again, so it can be used to create service principal in the Entra ID. And I think it's good to see multi-tenant app demo in this specific scenario. So I would like to show you how users from different directories can sign in to specific application. So let's see it right now. And obviously, when it comes to PowerShell script, we can also touch on that in a minute. Okay, so let's see it in action. So again, let's start with Microsoft Entra Admin Center. Here we have to register new multi-tenant application, so we have to provide the name. And under supported account types, we have to select accounts in any organizational directory, so any Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So once we register such application, this is my TMF multi-tenant app, we can see that it was successfully registered within this tenant, but under supported account types, we have multiple organizations. And also we can see this information that starting from November 9th, 2020, and users will no longer be able to grant consent to newly registered multi-tenant applications without verified publishers. So this is for the security purpose. But let's focus on the authentication right now. So let's open Blazor WebAssembly application to see how this application will work in context of multi-tenancy. So we will use the user account from the home tenant where this application is registered, but also we will try to use the user account from another Entra ID tenant as we did it for the single tenant application demo. So let's see it. Here is my multi-tenant application, and I will click Login button. Now I'm redirected to the authorization endpoint, and I will provide my home tenant account for now, Adele. So once I successfully authenticate, then I will be redirected back to the application, and I should see the claims from the ID token. So let's see. Yeah, okay, perfect. So we can see that here is my ID token decoded. I would say like those are the claims from the ID token. And as we can see, Adele successfully authenticated. And important information is that please note that here under TID claim, so tenant ID, we have the home tenant ID. The same is under issuer here. But now let's check what will happen if we will try to use user account from another Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So I will click Logout button. I will select Adele account, and I'm successfully signed out. So now let me grab another user account from another Entra ID tenant, and let's see what will happen once we try to authenticate. So now I will click Login button again, and here I will use another account from another Entra ID tenant. I will click Next. I will authenticate, and what will happen here in a second, we should see the consent screen. As you can see again, TMF multi-tenant app is unverified. This is this additional feature added by Microsoft. And also we see that this application would like to access your basic profile here. Yeah, so we can expand consents and we can read more about those permissions. So now if I click Accept button, then the service principal will be created under Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. Before I will do it, let's really quickly go to the Entra ID portal for Formula 5 Dev to see Enterprise Applications section. Here is Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. Important information. As you can see previously, we used app registration section to register application. And as you remember, I mentioned that app registration is just the template. It's like a class in the .NET C#. But service principals that will be provisioned or created from this application template will be visible under Enterprise Applications. So this is the section where we can access service principals that were provisioned from this specific application template. As we can see here in the Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant, there is no service principal yet. And of course I can click refresh button to make sure that there are no results. So now let's get back to our multi-tenant application and let's consent and let's grant permissions to this multi-tenant application, and let's get back to this enterprise application section then. So here on the consent screen, I will click accept button, and what is happening right now underneath, there is service principal provisioned in the Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. So I'm redirected back. So from the user perspective, user experience perspective, it's just an authentication. Yes. So here there is this greeting, hello tester account. There is ID token, as you can see, issued to this application, and underneath service principal was successfully created in this Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. Before we will check it, please note that right now the TID claim, so tenant ID, is different. This is the Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant ID, and the issuer is also different. Yeah. So this is the difference, and it's very important and to work carefully with those claims, because for instance, when we will talk about web APIs, it can be tricky, because if we will validate issuer, we have to be careful, yeah, because multi-tenant web API can be accessed from many different tenants, and then we have to be sure that tokens will be validated successfully. But this is what we will talk about in a minute in this video. Right now, let's check the service principal, whether it was created. Okay, perfect. So it's Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant again, no results. I'm clicking refresh button. And as we can see here, there is TMF multi-tenant application. So this is my service principal. So once user consented and authenticated successfully to multi-tenant application, the service principal was created in this another tenant, in this specific scenario, Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. Perfect. So now let's get back to the presentation. Perfect. So until now, we saw single tenant application and multi-tenant application. We talk about service principals, we talk about app provisioning, and now we understand what will happen underneath. The important thing is that it can be a little bit more complicated when we think about applications that will call APIs. And when you think about multi-tenant applications and multi-tenant web APIs, this can be quite challenging. So that's why it's also worth to talk about those concepts. So let's talk about API permissions and access concepts. So first of all, let's talk about the application ID URI. Application ID URI is one of the ways an application is identified when exposing specific scopes. The app ID URI for single tenant apps must be globally unique within that tenant only. So it means, to be honest, that it doesn't matter which name you will provide for application ID URI, it just has to be unique within this Entra ID tenant scope. And this specific application ID URI is set under expose an API. So this is for web API applications in Microsoft Entra. In contrast, for multi-tenant applications, it must be globally unique across all tenants, which ensures that Microsoft Entra ID can find the app across all tenants. So if this is multi-tenant web API, application ID URI has to be globally unique. This is super important. Okay, So now let's talk more about application ID URI. So on the left side, we have single tenant API, which is registered in the Microsoft Entra ID tenant. As you can see, application ID URI is API, something and some GUID and so on. So basically it has to be unique in this specific tenant only. This application ID URI can be automatically generated by the Entra portal here, so we don't have to modify it. Obviously we can, but we can also use the default value that will be generated by Microsoft Entra Admin Center. On the right side, we have multi-tenant web API, and as we can see, application ID URI has to be globally unique. So the recommended approach is to basically use the tenant name that on microsoft.com/API/ the name of the API. And then we can be sure that this will be globally unique value. Okay, so now let's talk about API exposure. So each API application registered in Microsoft Entra ID tenant defines scopes. Scopes are defined to restrict access to data and functionality protected by the web API. Yeah, so on the right side, we can see the scope definition screen. We can provide the name of the scope, like files.read, who can consent, admins only, admins and users, and also the consent display name and the description. So this is what will be displayed to the user on the consent screen. Now, once API scopes are exposed, we can specify access permissions for the applications that will call these APIs. So under API permissions section in the application section, we can set configure permissions. So we can say like, okay, my application will need to access this specific web API with this scope or scopes. In this specific scenario on the right side, we can see documents read scope. Applications are authorized to call APIs when they are granted permissions by users and administrators. Yeah, so in this specific scenario, again, we talk about the consent screen. So application has to be granted permissions to use and access specific API. API permissions list, important difference. So this is the API permissions section, and here we can define something what is called configure permissions. So this is the minimum list of permissions people will have to consent for the application. There could be more, but this will always be required. And it's super important. So if we define the application and we want to provide some additional access to APIs like Microsoft Graph API or our custom web APIs, it's good to define those configure permissions here, because first of all, administrators can look and see, oh, okay, so this application needs those permissions, and they can also grant admin consent directly from the Entra Admin Center. But also from the application perspective, if we will use default scope, then application will ask the user for all the permissions that were configured here under configure permissions. And this can be helpful when we want to grant all permissions at once. So once permissions are granted, application can function correctly. So this is really recommended. Like if you know that some of the permissions are required from the beginning of usage of the application, configure them here on this list. Okay. So now let's talk about possible scenarios when it comes to web applications, APIs, because this can be also tricky. When it comes to single tenant application and web API, it's quite simple. So we have user is using an application, is authenticating within this application. Here we use obviously the authorization endpoint of the tenant. So login.microsoftonline.com/tenant ID. And here in this tenant, we have application basically, but also this application is calling web API. So underneath, we have two service principals within this tenant. One for application, one for service, one for web API. So in this specific scenario, once we grant consents, then application can call web API. So access token is returned to the application, and application can call web API with this access token. So it's quite simple when it comes to single tenant applications. So now I want to show you this specific sample. So single tenant application and web API. So let's start. Here is Microsoft Entra Admin Center again and my home tenant. And as you can see here, I register single tenant API. So under supported account types, you can see my organization only. Now I want to expose this API so it can be used and called by the applications registered in Entra ID tenant. So under Expose an API tab, as you can see, I have my application ID URI. This is what I talk about in the presentation. And here is my unique identifier within this tenant. When it comes to single tenant APIs, it has to be only unique within the tenant scope, not the global scope. And under scope defined by this API, I can click Add a Scope, and here I can define the scope and who can consent, like admins only, admins and users. I have to provide the display name, description, so those details will be displayed on the consent screen. Here I already created a scope, so documents read, admins only can consent to that in this specific scenario, and you can see that this specific permission allows the application to read sign-in users' documents. Yeah, and here this is basically what will be displayed on the admin and users screen specifically. And let's change it admins and users just for now for the test. So I will click Save, and now this scope, this permission can be consented by both administrators and users. So in this specific scenario, once I added this scope, I will get back to app registrations and I will select single tenant application. And here under single tenant application, I will click API permissions because now I want to access the API I created from this application. So here, as you can see, I already have some permissions like user read, so read basic profile of the user, application.read all, basically, so read all the applications for the user. This is for Microsoft Graph API, we'll talk about it in a minute. But here, I have to click Add Permission and then switch to my organization, API my organization uses. And here, let's try to find a single tenant API. Yeah, so as you can see, this is my single tenant API. Delegated permissions are selected. And here is my scope. Documents read. Allow the app to read sign-in user documents. So I will select this one. And as you can see, it's added here. Because of the fact that I selected users and admins can consent, admin consent is not required here. So it's set to no. So right now, my application has this configure permission here. So my application will call this specific web API. So here, if I click on this scope, you can see that here is the scope name. So we have to copy it because in a minute we will see how application source code is configured. So we can call this specific web API. Perfect. So now let's see the application code. Here is Visual Studio and I have two projects here. So single tenant application, Blazor WebAssembly application, and ASP.NET Core Web API. Let's open the Blazor app configuration first. I'm using Microsoft Authentication Library here. And as you can see, I have to provide the configuration. So I have to bind the Azure AD configuration, so my client ID and also the authority. And the important part here is that I am also defining access token scopes here. So I have this method called default access token scopes add, and here I'm adding the scope of my web API and it's documents.read. Okay, so before I will launch this sample, let's see the web API configuration. So on the web API side here, I have this library called Microsoft Identity Web used. So this is another library from Microsoft to securing web APIs and applications. And here, as you can see, I'm validating the audience, which should be this. So this is my unique identifier of the API. I also want to verify the issuer, validate the issuer here. So who issued this token, whether it was my tenant or not. So if I will close that, let's really quickly launch this application. Here is launch application. I will click login button. And again, I will use Adele account from this local Entra ID directory. And, sorry, the password is wrong. And now consent screen is displayed. So obviously there is information about accessing basic profile of the user on behalf of this application, but also we can see that there is information that this application would like to read your documents. Yeah, so allows the app to read your documents. And this is about single tenant API here. So if I click next, there is also information that Web API would like to access basic user profile because there is user that read scope by default created for each application. It doesn't matter if it's Web API or web app. And once I click accept, then I'm successfully authenticated. I'm redirected back to the application, but now I will get two tokens. ID token for my application to identify myself, and also access token to call API. So if I scroll down, those are the claims from the ID token, but also underneath we can see data returned from the single tenant API. So document 1, document 2, document 3. Because we send access token within the request to this Web API, and API validated the token and returned the data for this specific user. Perfect. So this is about the single tenant application. It's not about multi-tenancy here. If I will try to use account from another Entra ID tenant here, I will end up with exactly with the same situation as before. I cannot access this web application with external account. Okay, perfect. So I will log out here. And now let's get back to the presentation and let's talk a little bit more about multi-tenant scenarios. So that's it about single tenant applications. As you can see, it's pretty simple when we have all applications in the same tenant, and those are single tenant applications. Service principals are automatically created for us. If we create application from the Azure portal or Microsoft Entra Admin Center, you have to know that service principal is automatically created for you underneath. So it's really simple. The only thing you have to worry about is the code configuration and basically grant specific permissions to access your APIs within the tenant. That's it. Now let's talk about multi-tenant application and multi-tenant web API, both in the same Microsoft Entra ID tenant. I mean, when I say both in the same tenant, I mean application registrations, both in the same tenant. So on the left side, we have user, we have application, yeah? And obviously this application wants to call web API in the end, but before it can do it, we need specific permissions to be granted and we need service principals. So what will happen here? When user will try to log in, obviously the common endpoint will be used and user will see consent screen. So consent screen will be displayed. There will be information whether user would like to grant permissions and this application would like to access basic profile, would like to access, for instance, documents as we saw before for single tenant application. And the case is that in this specific scenario, to make sure that both service principals will be automatically created in the customer's tenant, we have to use the property in the app manifest that is called non-client applications. What's going on here? Basically, if we have single application, like this application can be multi-tenant, but it will not call API, that's not a problem because we will grant consents and basically service principal will be provisioned in the customer's tenant. But in case of scenario where we have application and web API, so application would like to access specific resource, which is API, first we need to provision service principal for the web API and then provision service principal for the application. That's the rule in the Microsoft Entra ID world. So without this property, I mean non-client applications, we will get error because even if we consent, then Entra ID will inform us that there is no service principal provision for Web API in the tenant. So application cannot access this resource. It does not exist in the customer's tenant. So that's why we need both service principals to be provisioned in the customer's tenant. And we can achieve that by using known client applications property. So this known client applications property contains the list of the application IDs that are well known for web APIs. So in this case, we can say, okay, those applications are known client applications. So Entra ID will look into this property, will provision the service principal first for the web API and then for the application. And we will not get the error. So I would say in the final scenario, user will authenticate, both service principals were created. So application service principal, web API service principal, and user can start using the application. So let's talk about admin consent order here. So it's very important because as I mentioned before, we can get some errors during the authentication process and consents process. So how to avoid them? So let's talk about admin consent order. We have application that we'll call web API. So again, the same scenario. So multi-tenant web API service principal must be provisioned first as a resource that multi-tenant app will access. This is what I mentioned before. If we have such scenario, web API service principal has to be provisioned first. Then service principal for the application. So next, application service principal must be provisioned. That's the rule here. Every time you will try to access web API, I mean in the multi-tenant scenario, and the service principal will not exist for web API and you will not use known client applications property, you will get the error in your application. So let's see it in action. I want to show you that. This is more complex scenario, but I think still very interesting. So let's dive into the code. Okay, so here is the Visual Studio and my two multi-tenant projects. The first one is Blazor multi-tenant application and ASP.NET Core Web API, also multi-tenant. Let's open configuration for Blazor first. As you can see, again, I'm using Microsoft Authentication Library here. An important part here is this one, default access token scopes. So as you can see here, I added the scope to access multi-tenant application. And now important thing, as you remember, I mentioned known applications and admin consent endpoint and PowerShell approaches. So if we use known applications approach, so basically we will add the client ID of the web application to known applications property of web API, then default access token scopes should be set to .default. So then during the authentication, users see the consent screen and then underneath Azure AD can provision service principals for both applications. And this is obviously only for the scenario where we have two app registrations within the same tenant. So in this specific scenario, once we add client ID of the web application to known applications, property of web API, then Entra ID will know how to provision those service principals into the customer's tenant. However, if we decide to use admin consent endpoint or PowerShell script approach, then we can directly indicate the scope of our web API, so documents read in this specific scenario. Before I will launch this sample, let me really quickly go to Visual Studio Code and show you the PowerShell script and admin consent endpoint again, so we can really briefly conclude on them. So here is the PowerShell script that enables global administrators to sign in and provision service principal within their tenants. So as you can see here, to connect to Microsoft Graph, I have to provide the tenant ID, my tenant ID, and also provide the app ID, so the client ID of the application, multi-tenant application, for which service principal needs to be provisioned in my tenant. So here I use this new mg service principal commandlet, and I have to pass this information. And this script will enable us to create service principal in our tenant. And important information, this is the simplest way. I mean, with this script, you can first provision service principal for the API, then you can use the same script to provision service principal for the calling application, and then from the application source code, you don't have to worry about anything. You just define the scope to access your web API, like documents read, and that's it. Also, you can use admin consent endpoint. This is another approach I mentioned before. So as you can see here, you have to use your tenant ID. So this is the tenant ID in which we want to provision service principal. And the client ID is the client ID of the multi-tenant application that we want to provision, for which we want to provision service principal in our tenant. And again, we can use this specific endpoint to provision service principals. And then again, we don't have to, make special changes within our application source code. And again, we can use the specific scope to call our web API. Last thing, important, script to update known applications. That's very important too. So as you can see, with this script, we can add known client applications to the web API manifest, and then we will be able to provision both service principals in the customer's tenant. That's very important. Without the known client applications property filled out, we will see the error that there is no service principal for the web API that this application is trying to call. Okay, perfect. So I've already used known applications script here, and I added my application client ID to known applications property of my web API. So right now, let's see how this multi-tenant application can work with this multi-tenant web API. But before that, let's look into the configuration for the multi-tenant web API, and then we will launch both applications. So to summarize, we have two options. If we decide to use known applications approach, then the scope has to be set to .default, and then we should see the consent screen, information that application is trying to access web API, those permissions are required, and then service principals are provisioned in the customer's tenant. Or if we want to avoid using default scope here and we want to use directly the API scope here, we have to use admin consent endpoint or PowerShell approach. So at the moment of recording this video, there is something what is called app bundling on the horizon. So in the future, it will be simplified in the Microsoft Entra to make sure that if we have multi-tenant solution which consists of application and API, those service principals will be easily provisioned into the customer's tenants. But for now, please remember that if you have multi-tenant application and multi-tenant API, both register in the same tenant, please use known applications property of your web API, and then you have to update the scope to be .default, and then it will work. If you try to use this scope without known applications approach, then you will see the error that there is no service principal for the web API. Okay, perfect. So now let's look really quickly into the web API configuration. So again, I'm using Microsoft Identity Web library here. And as you can see here, first of all, I set validate issuer to false, because as you remember, in the issuer, we can have different tenants, IDs. There can be multiple issuers basically, because this is web API that is multi-tenant. So it can be issued by multiple Entra ID tenants. Valid audience is set to unique app URI for this API. As you remember, I mentioned that this has to be globally unique. And also, as you can see, I have this on-token validated event. I subscribe to this event. And now let's talk a little bit more about it. So in this event, I can check the claims in the access token. So in this specific scenario, TID claim, so tenant ID claim. And this is very important because at the moment of recording this video, you cannot set in the Entra Admin Center or Azure portal from which tenants users can access your multi-tenant application or web API. So in this specific scenario, you have to handle it from the application code. So if you are a developer, identity architect, you have to think about it, because in this event, you can check the tenant ID claim and you can compare it with the values, let's say, stored in your database. For the demo purpose, I created this simple array here, allowed tenants, and here is the Formula 5 dev tenant ID. So I'm allowing users from this tenant only to use this API. So if the tenant ID is other than that, there is unauthorized access exception return. This tenant is not allowed to call this web API. And obviously in the production workloads, you should use some database, store this configuration and check values against database to make sure that you limit the access to your multi-tenant web API. The second thing is that for now, there is no place in Entra where you can check from which tenants users are using your application or web API. I mean, multi-tenant application or web API. So that's why this is also a good place where you can check the tenant ID, you can record that, and in the end, you can say like, okay, users from those tenants with those IDs are using our multi-tenant application. Okay, perfect. So right now it's time to launch this solution and see this multi-tenant solution in action. Before I will do it really quickly, this is Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. And as you remember, the web application service principal, the multi-tenant application, is registered here. So it's already created, but web API service principal is not provisioned yet. So let's see it in action. So let's try to sign in with the user from this tenant, and let's try to access the web API we saw a minute before. One important thing, in my home tenant where I registered originally application and API, for the API in the app manifest, you can see that under non-client applications, I have client ID of my multi-tenant application. I mean the Blazor one. So in this case, when I will try to sign into application and call this API or get the access token to call this API, then Entra will look into this property, and then Entra will be able to provision service principal in the customer's tenant first for web API and then for the web application. But obviously for the app, we already have it, so it will only provision the web API service principal. Okay, so here is Blazor multi-tenant application. I'm clicking login button, and now I will use the basic user account from the another Entra ID tenant, so Formula 5 Dev tenant. So here I'm signing in, and after a second or two, I should see the consent screen. We can see that application is unverified. Yeah, we see that application would like to sign in and read our profile, but also there is this information. If you accept, TMF multi-tenant API will also have access to your user profile information. So if I click accept button here, what we will see in a minute, the admin consent will be required here. As you can see, there is this information, need admin approval. Why? Because as I mentioned before, the applications from verified publishers can be consent only. So in this specific scenario, basic user cannot consent to application from unverified publisher. So right now what we need to do basically to grant permissions here, we need admin approval. So here I will click have an admin account, sign in with that account, and here I will use the global administrator account in Formula 5 tenant. So let me really quickly use this account to sign in, and as you can see, MFA is enabled here, so I have to accept this request, and once it's approved, then there is consent screen displayed. So this application would like to sign in and read your profile, and also this application, also there is TMF multi-tenant API, which would like to also have access to your profile. So here I can either accept on behalf of myself as an administrator, so still users will be blocked, or I can click consent on behalf of my organization. So then users from my organization will be able to use this application without any consents granting. So I will grant this on behalf of my organization. So I will click accept. And right now, obviously, service principal for web API is provisioned. Service principal for the application is provisioned. And after that, I can successfully access this application. So as you can see, there are ID token claims here, and below I can access data from the multi-tenant API. So now basically if we go to the formula5.dev Entra ID tenant, we will see that there are two service principals created. Let's do it now. As we can see, this is formula5.dev Entra tenant. And here I have both service principals created for multi-tenant application and multi-tenant API. And both are visible under enterprise applications, where we can access provisioned service principals. Perfect. So before we continue, important information. For the Graph API, there is an exception. Graph API has its own service principal in each Entra ID tenant. So that's the only exception. So for Graph API, we don't have to provision any service principals. Service principal is already provisioned in your Entra ID tenant. So the only thing is that for some permissions in Microsoft Graph tenant, you will have to grant admin consent. So that's very important to underline. Okay, perfect. So let's get back to the presentation. Okay, so let's talk about one more scenario. This one is rare, but still possible. So we have multi-tenant application and API, but both in different Microsoft Entra ID tenants. So application would like to call web API. So now both app registrations exist in two different tenants. So let's start with this diagram here. So we have three Entra ID tenants. Tenant 1, developer 1's tenant, tenant 2, developer 2 tenant, and customer's tenant. So now let's talk about the scenario where we have application that would like to call web API on behalf of authenticated user in the multi-tenant world. So we have app registration in the tenant 2, and this is app registration for the web API. And let's say that we have also application that should call this web API. And this application is in the tenant 1. So now, before the application from the tenant 1 can call and access this web API from tenant 2, the service principal has to be provisioned in the tenant 1. And also, it has to be provisioned in the customer's tenant. Why? Because of the fact that application, the app registration for the app is done in the tenant 1. So before application can access web API, we need service principals to be created for web API. But because of the fact that application registration is in a tenant 1, not in 2, we have to also create service principal for this application in the customer's tenant. So now, once we have web API service principal created in the customer's tenant and application service principal created in the customer's tenant, we will be able to successfully grant consent and access this application. And it's crucial because if we have two tenants like tenant 1 and tenant 2 and app registrations in both tenants, like application is registered in tenant 1, web API is registered in the tenant 2, we first need to provision service principals for web API and in the tenant 1 and in the customer's tenant. Why? Because still application from the tenant 1 needs to connect to this web API, and then this application, a service principal, has to be provisioned in the customer's tenant. So this is, I would say, really complex architecture, really rare, so do not expect to have such implementations in the future, but it's still good to understand that if both applications are registered in different tenants, you will have to follow the specific steps to create service principals here. So for this scenario, I really recommend using the PowerShell script I presented to you. So in this specific scenario, you can first create service principal in the tenant 1 and customer tenant for web API, and then you can use PowerShell script to provision service principal for the application in the customer tenant. Okay, perfect. So now let's talk a little bit more about special considerations for APIs and daemon applications. If we want to use admin consent endpoint, we have to add user.read permission to API or daemon app registration. It is required because with admin consent endpoint, administrator must authenticate first. So without this permission, it's not possible for administrator to authenticate. So even if this is web API, if we want to use admin consent, we need this user.read permission. So also redirect URI must be provided for successful redirection. But the most important thing here is this user.read permission. So that's why in practice, what I can say here, and this is also a recommendation from Microsoft, the best option for now is just to use simple PowerShell script to provision service principals, and then you can avoid, like additional configuration on the Entra side and also on the application source code side. Okay, last thing, some best practices for multi-tenant applications. Test application in a tenant that has configured conditional access policies. This is really important because you can be surprised that in your tenant application worked, and then you provision service principals in your customer tenant, and then because of the fact that conditional access policies are configured in the customer tenant, users will not be able to use or access this specific multi-tenant application. Follow the principle of least user access to ensure that your app only requests permissions it needs. This is really important because it can look suspicious when your application will ask for many different kinds of permissions to access organization data, users' profiles, user read-write, and so on. So be careful about it. Yeah, just use the minimum amount of permissions that your multi-tenant application needs to operate properly. So least privilege principle here. Provide appropriate names and descriptions for any permissions you expose as a part of your application. This helps users and administrators know what they are agreeing to when they attempt to use your app's APIs. So this is really crucial. It's about consent screen. Yes, inform properly those users and global administrators about the permissions and what application is trying to access. Use Microsoft Authentication Library because it can handle multi-tenant scenarios and handle tokens properly. Because of the fact that we have this common endpoint, it's not clear which tenant ID is used at the first glance. Yes, user will go to the common endpoint, user will provide the username, and then Entra ID will discover from which tenant this user is, and then user will be authenticated against this tenant. From the source code perspective, it can be tricky, yes, because we can have, multiple authorities, and it can be catchy from the caching perspective also. So Microsoft Authentication Library will make it much easier to implement scenarios for multi-tenant applications. Try to use app roles instead of security groups. These can be unavailable in each tenant where service principal is provisioned. That's very important because even if you create security groups in your home tenant and you create multi-tenant application, it doesn't mean that those security groups will be available in your customers' tenants. Okay, perfect. So that's it about single tenant and multi-tenant applications in Microsoft Entra ID. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope that you found it interesting and helpful. And I hope to see you in the next videos. Thank you so much.